Some mornings arrive with such unsettling stillness that the heart senses a turning point, long before the world notices. It is the kind of dawn that quietly rearranges destiny, whispering that the choices made today will echo far beyond the moment they are born. And sometimes, hidden within the gentlest beginning, waits a stranger whose presence can shift the direction of an entire life. A single act of compassion can become the spark that awakens a truth the world believed forgotten. The dawn in Udala unfolded slowly, a quiet wash of gold spreading across clay rooftops and winding paths still heavy with night's fading breath. Amara stepped into the morning with her basket of warm bread held close, the aroma rising softly like a blessing earned through the long hours she and her mother had worked before sunrise. Baking had always been their anchor, each loaf shaped with determination, each morning a vow to keep moving forward despite the weight of struggle. Yet today, as she walked through the familiar calm of early light, something in the air felt different. The silence carried a strange anticipation, as though the world stood on the edge of revealing a secret. Her steps slowed as she neared the ancient Udala tree, a silent guardian whose roots had witnessed triumphs, heartbreaks, and stories older than memory itself. Beneath its wide branches lay a figure that disrupted the harmony of dawn. A man collapsed into the dust, his body folded in the kind of exhaustion that spoke of days without rest or nourishment. His clothes were worn thin, their once fine threads dulled by hardship. His breathing came in shallow tremors, yet his posture held a faint trace of dignity, an echo of a life that had not always been marked by suffering. Amara's breath tightened. Her basket felt heavier suddenly, not with bread, but with the choice it demanded of her. She knew the value of what she carried. Each loaf could bring enough coin to support her home, to shield her mother from worry for another day. But the sight before her stirred something deeper than practicality. Hunger was a language she understood, the quiet ache, the fading strength, the humiliation of needing, yet having nothing to offer the world. Compassion rose in her, firm and clear, untangled from hesitation. She knelt beside him and offered the warmest loaf in her basket, her voice gentle but unwavering. The man shifted, his eyelids lifting with difficulty until his eyes met hers, dull with exhaustion, yet still carrying a faint light, a flicker of identity refusing to die out. As he raised his trembling hand to accept the bread, something unexpected caught her attention. A carved wooden bracelet sat around his wrist, intricate and deliberate in its craftsmanship. The symbols etched into its surface were unmistakable, patterns from an ancient noble lineage, one spoken of only in fading tales, believed to have vanished after a tragedy buried in the whispers of elders. A shiver of curiosity moved through her. The bracelet did not belong to a wanderer. It belonged to someone born into a world shaped by history, reverence, and responsibility. The strangeness of the moment pressed deeper as the rising sunlight glinted against the carved wood, revealing details far too precise to be simple decoration. This was heritage. This was a legacy. This was a story the world thought ended long ago. The man accepted the loaf carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid it might slip from his hands. When he began to eat, every movement spoke of restraint and gratitude, revealing how long he had gone without such kindness. Amara watched him quietly, feeling the morning shift around them with an awareness that something larger than charity had begun weaving its way into her life. She sensed that this encounter carried a significance she could not yet understand, a quiet opening in the path she had walked for so long. Nothing about this felt accidental. The hunger, the bracelet, the collapse beneath her path, it all formed an invisible thread, pulling her toward a truth still wrapped in shadows. As the breeze moved through the leaves overhead, Amara wondered if fate sometimes waited at the edges of ordinary mornings, waiting to reveal itself when a heart chose compassion over fear. Why would a starving wanderer protect the sacred emblem of a noble bloodline the world believed erased, And what unexpected truth had destiny placed in Amara's path at the break of dawn, waiting to unfold with a momentum she could no longer stop? Some silences feel comforting at first, soft enough to pass as calm, until you sense the subtle tremor woven inside them. A quiet warning that danger often hides behind gentle tones. For a moment after eating, the stranger remained quiet, gathering breath and strength as though each swallow helped piece together fragments of his identity that hardship had scattered. When he finally lifted his head, he introduced himself in a soft, steady voice, offering the name Chaka with a grace that felt strangely out of place for a man found collapsed beneath a tree. His words flowed with a quiet refinement, choosing their path carefully, as though shaped by a life once molded through dignity and discipline. There was humility in his tone, the kind worn into someone who had known better days and endured their loss with a patience built from experience. His voice carried neither desperation nor arrogance, only a muted resilience, as if he had learned to balance weakness with honor. Amara studied him, feeling an unsettled curiosity rising within her. Something about the way he spoke, measured, calm, deliberate, did not match his torn clothing or the exhaustion etched into his face. His posture, even in vulnerability, carried the subtle imprint of someone raised with structure, someone who had once lived according to rules shaped by culture and expectation. She sensed an internal map within him, one that guided his gestures and choices, even when the world around him had crumbled. It was this contrast that held her attention, the tension between who he appeared to be and who he truly was beneath the dust and fatigue. His silence didn't feel empty. It felt protected, carefully arranged, like a fragile truth waiting for the right moment to be spoken. Before Amara could ask more, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. A group of market boys approached with hurried energy, their voices loud enough to stir the quiet air into unease. They recognized Chika immediately, not from proximity, but from rumors that had traveled through villages like restless whispers. Without hesitation, they accused him of stealing from vendors in a nearby town, their words sharp with certainty and fueled by a confidence born more from gossip than fact. They had not seen him commit anything. They simply saw a starving man and matched him to the shape of a story they had already accepted as truth. The market boys' voices carried quickly, reaching others in the area who turned with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Within moments, the gentle morning dissolved into tense murmurs and guarded stares. People drifted closer, forming an invisible boundary around Cheek, their reactions shaped by fear of the unknown rather than understanding. Rumors, once faint, now took on the weight of possibility. The crowd's presence shifted the atmosphere, pressing in around Amara with a tension that felt heavier than the breadbasket she carried earlier. The silence Chike had maintained no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a storm gathering beneath the surface, expanding with each accusation thrown into the air. Chike remained composed, neither defending himself nor falling apart beneath the weight of judgment. His calmness seemed to confuse the crowd even more, as though they expected him to panic or run, to behave like a man with guilt heavy on his conscience. Instead, he lowered his gaze and breathed steadily, accepting the moment with a grace that felt unsettling in the rising chaos. Amara could feel something tightening inside her, the discomfort of watching injustice unfold, the frustration of seeing people replace truth with convenience. There was a clarity in her that pierced through the noise, a force that pushed her to look not at the accusations, but at the man himself, at the quiet strength still flickering through his exhaustion. The marketplace, once a place of exchange and familiar chatter, now felt like a courtroom without fairness, its judgment fueled by fear rather than reason. Amara sensed the crowd waiting for someone to speak first, to turn rumor into verdict. She felt her heartbeat grow louder, as if urging her to respond before assumptions sealed the man's fate. The tension around her sharpened into something almost physical, a pressure that demanded a choice. She could step back, let the moment unfold without her, allow fear to swallow truth without resistance. Or she could step forward, trusting the instinct that had pulled her toward compassion in the first place. The silence stretched, charged and expectant, holding its breath for her decision. Will Amara stand against the rising tide of fear and suspicion, risking her place in the village to defend a stranger whose secrets she barely understands? Or will the storm of uncertainty pull him deeper into danger before she finds her voice? True bravery is rarely loud. It rises in the quiet seconds when the world turns its back, asking nothing and offering no applause. It is born in the soft spaces of the heart, where fear and conviction collide. And sometimes, courage chooses a person long before they believe they are capable of carrying it. The tension in the marketplace tightened, like a cord pulled slowly toward breaking, the air thick with suspicion as villagers pressed in around Chaik. Their whispers swelled into a restless hum, fragmented doubts, half-formed accusations, old wounds triggered by stories of theft in other towns. Amara felt the weight of their voices pressing against her chest, pushing her toward the easy path of silence. It would have been natural to step away, to let the rumors settle into a narrative that relieved her of responsibility. Yet something inside her resisted that surrender. The memory of finding Chika collapsed beneath the Udala tree lingered vividly. The fragility of his breathing, the dignity in his posture, the gratitude in his eyes when she offered her last loaf. That moment had planted something in her, a sense of duty rooted not in obligation, but in humanity. As the crowd edged closer, she felt her pulse thrumming with an intensity she had not expected. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate, guided by a force she did not fully understand. Positioning herself between Chaik and the forming circle of villagers, she lifted her chin with a quiet steadiness that surprised even her. The murmurs around her shifted, some startled by her boldness, others offended by it. She sensed their uncertainty, their discomfort at seeing a young woman insert herself into a conflict many believed was already decided. But Amara remained firm, holding her ground with a resolve that rose not from confidence, but from a deep moral clarity she could no longer ignore. She spoke not with aggression, but with plain truth, telling them that the man behind her was starving, not plotting. Her voice carried a calm certainty that cut through the charged atmosphere, reminding the villagers that hunger often mimicked guilt in the eyes of those who expected wrongdoing. She explained the trembling in his hands, the pallor in his skin, the way exhaustion had nearly silenced his breath. She pointed out the evidence of vulnerability rather than malice, drawing attention to the details most had overlooked in their rush to judge. Her words wove reason into the noise, urging them to see with compassion rather than fear. The villagers responded with mixed reactions. Some listened, their expressions softening as they examined the situation through her eyes. Others frowned with skepticism, questioning whether she was too trusting for her own good. A few dismissed her entirely, insisting that her kindness clouded her judgment. Their debates unfolded in low, heated tones, each opinion revealing more about their own fears than about Chika himself. Yet despite their disagreements, something subtle shifted in the air. Her courage had slowed their certainty, forced hesitation into their assumptions, and planted doubt in the narrative they had been too willing to believe. Chaik, still weakened but conscious of the unfolding scene, watched Amara with an expression she could not decipher. Shock, gratitude, and disbelief blended together in his eyes, creating a depth of emotion that caught even her off guard. He had expected hostility, distance, perhaps pity, but not this unwavering shield rising from someone who owed him nothing. He saw in her a conviction untouched by fear, a clarity that pushed against the weight of the crowd. It struck him with a quiet force, reminding him of a kind of loyalty he had once known, long before betrayal had stripped his world apart. The villagers continued their murmurs, unsure whether to challenge her further or step back from their mounting anger. Amara felt the pressure closing in, felt the possibility that her choice might isolate her, create friction she had not anticipated. Yet she did not waver. She understood now that courage was rarely comfortable. It demanded standing in places where certainty wavered and navigating storms that arrived without warning. And though she could not see the full consequence of her decision, she sensed its importance. This moment was shaping more than the fate of a stranger. It was shaping who she was becoming. Even as she held firm, the air vibrated with the tension of unresolved fear, as though the ground beneath them had begun to shift into unfamiliar territory. She could not know what forces churned beneath the surface of Cheek's past, nor how deeply her choice now wove her life into his. But in that moment, she felt certain of one thing. Honor required standing for what was right, even when danger hid quietly inside the crowd. Amara stepped unknowingly into a conflict woven with dangers far beyond the marketplace, one that could pull her into shadows she has never imagined, simply because she chose to stand on the side of truth. Sometimes a warm meal wakes the ghosts a heart fights to forget, pulling buried truths toward the surface with every breath. Amara guided Cheeky carefully along the narrow path toward her home, the fading light stretching across the sky in crimson bands that signaled the end of a long, uncertain day. Her mother stood at the doorway, worry tightening her expression the moment she saw a stranger leaning heavily on her daughter's arm. She whispered Amara's name with a tone that carried fear more than disapproval, her eyes scanning Cheek with the instinct of someone who had learned to protect her family by reading danger before it spoke. Amara reassured her gently, explaining in a soft voice how she had found him, how hunger had nearly broken him, and how leaving him beneath a tree would have been no different from abandoning him to fate. The explanation did not erase her mother's anxiety, but the sincerity in Amara's eyes softened her resistance. With a quiet exhale, she stepped aside and allowed them to enter. Inside, the small home carried the familiar warmth of evening, the lingering aroma of cooked yam, the faint crackle of fire settling in the hearth, and the gentle quiet that came after a long day. Amara helped Cheek sit at their modest wooden table before preparing a simple plate for him. Her mother watched each movement with the caution of a woman who measured safety, not by appearances, but by intuition, sharpened over years. Yet she said nothing, observing with the quiet patience she had learned from hardship. Cheek offered a faint nod of gratitude, his voice nearly a whisper as he thanked them, though his tone held a depth that hinted at a practiced reverence. Before he touched the food, he placed both hands lightly on the table and closed his eyes. The prayer he spoke was soft, but carried a cadence filled with ceremony and tradition, the kind passed down through generations of families who valued lineage, honor, and sacred rituals. The words were foreign to Amara, yet their rhythm stirred something familiar in the quiet air, as though the home itself recognized the dignity woven into them. Her mother paused mid-motion, her brows lifting slightly, not in suspicion now, but in recognition. Only noble households used prayers like that, and only those raised within disciplined heritage spoke with such intentional grace. When Chika finished, he ate slowly, each bite taken with deliberate respect, as though he carried memories of meals eaten around grander tables, tables where elegance and responsibility once lived side by side. Yet the heaviness in his eyes dimmed the echoes of that past. The grief that settled over him seemed rooted in more than hunger. It was the kind of sorrow that carried weight across years, shaped by loss too deep for casual conversation. Silence wrapped around him, not the silence of a man withholding truth, but the silence of someone navigating wounds that still felt raw. Amara watched him in the flicker of firelight, seeing how his gaze drifted occasionally toward the wooden bracelet on his wrist, the same one carved with symbols that belonged to a family, long vanished from public memory. Each time his eyes shifted toward it, something in his expression tightened, subtle, restrained, but unmistakably painful. It was as if the bracelet carried not only history, but burden, holding pieces of a life he was no longer able to return to. Her mother, though reserved, softened gradually, noticing the sincerity in his movements, the humility in his posture. When he thanked her again, this time with clearer strength, she offered him a blanket and a place near the hearth where he could rest. Amara felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest at this gesture. Their home, though small and fragile under the weight of daily struggle, had always been a place where compassion found space to breathe. As night deepened, the village sounds faded, leaving only the gentle hum of insects and the soft crackle of the dying fire. The air grew still, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Chika rested against the wall, his eyes half closed, but Amara sensed he was not fully asleep. There was tension beneath his calm, as if his mind lingered in memories he wished he could escape, yet could not silence. He looked like someone who had once belonged to a life built with structure and honor, only to have that life shattered by forces he still carried in silence. Amara wanted to ask him what sorrow weighed so heavily on him, what story hid beneath the carved symbols on his wrist, and what path had brought him from heritage to hunger. But she sensed the fragility of the moment and held her questions close, knowing some truths surface only when the heart is ready. What tragedy had torn Cheek away from a world shaped by heritage and honor, leaving him to wander alone into the night, carrying a past too heavy to speak and a future trembling on the edge of revelation? A man may hide his story behind silence, but his hands forever reveal the truth, shaping memories into motion long before the heart dares to speak. Days passed gently in Udala, carrying with them a quiet transformation that began in the small, humble bakery Amara and her mother tended each dawn. Cheek, still recovering strength, refused to sit idle. Each morning he rose before the sun, moving through the space with a focus that seemed instinctive, like someone stepping into a life he once knew intimately. The clay oven, long cracked from years of wear, became his first project. He knelt beside it with the patience of someone capable of seeing not just what was broken, but what it could return to. His fingers traced the fissures with quiet respect before mixing a clay blend that matched the old structure perfectly. His movements held precision, revealing a practiced familiarity with craftsmanship far beyond what ordinary villagers possessed. Amara watched silently from a distance, struck by the natural authority in his posture. There was a reverence in the way he handled every tool, every piece of wood, every lump of clay. He worked with humility yet confidence, a blend she found strangely captivating. Her mother, initially cautious, found herself pausing to observe him too, recognizing that this was not ordinary skill. This was training shaped under the guidance of artisans, mentors, or perhaps a family tradition steeped in pride. Chakai never boasted of his ability. He simply worked as though the bakery's survival mattered to him on a level deeper than gratitude. When customers arrived later that week, they were greeted by bread that bore subtle improvements, a firmer crust, a warmer scent, a softness that melted easily on the tongue. Word traveled quickly across Udala, carried by satisfied whispers from neighbors and travelers alike. More people returned each day, some curious, others hopeful, all drawn by a flavor that felt both new and strangely nostalgic. Amara watched their delighted expressions with quiet pride, knowing that Chaik's influence had breathed life into something her family had fought to sustain for years. Yet she sensed that each loaf he shaped carried a deeper meaning for him, a memory perhaps, or an echo of a time he no longer spoke about. The days were filled with progress and gentle gratitude, but the nights told another story. When the village quieted and the last lamps dimmed, Cheek slipped outside with a small bundle of wood and the same simple knife he had carried the day he arrived. Amara first noticed the glow of the moon reflecting on carved shavings near the side of the house. Curiosity drew her closer, though she made sure not to intrude. From a careful distance, she saw Cheek seated on a low stool, his posture steady, his focus sharp. His hands moved with delicate precision as he carved symbols that mirrored the markings on the wooden bracelet he never removed. Each stroke of his knife carried an intensity that made the air around him feel charged. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, shifted between concentration and a grief so raw it seemed to deepen the shadows. The carvings slowly took shape, patterns familiar yet mysterious, lines woven with meaning older than the village itself. Amara sensed that these symbols were not mere decorations. They were fragments of history he could not allow himself to forget. The wood carried his memories the way the bracelet carried his lineage. But with each new carving, his shoulders tensed, as though the act of remembering was both a comfort and a wound. Some nights, he paused in the middle of carving, his gaze frozen on the half-shaped symbol, eyes clouded with thoughts he did not speak. The silence surrounding him felt heavy, filled with stories locked behind closed doors of the heart. Amara could see the internal struggle within him, the pull of heritage, the weight of loss, and the quiet torment of a truth he was not ready to reveal. There was something unspoken tying him to the patterns he carved, something deeper than nostalgia. She sensed that each symbol carried a piece of a life interrupted, a family torn apart, a legacy stolen before he could claim it. The more she watched him, the more she realized these carvings were not simply art. They were memory, identity, and longing etched into wood. They held pain, but also defiance, as if he were determined to preserve what others tried to erase. What untold history lies inside the symbols Chica cannot stop carving. Memories so powerful, they return each night, demanding to be shaped into the world before darkness closes in again. When thunder fractures the sky, it drags hidden truths to the surface, secrets long buried, fears long silenced, and destinies long wandering for a moment of release. The sky over Udala darkened with an unexpected swiftness, heavy clouds rolling in as if pushed by invisible hands carrying urgency. The air shifted abruptly, thickening with the electric tension that precedes a storm, powerful enough to reorder the ground beneath it. Amara noticed the sudden chill while helping her mother stack the last trays in the bakery. Before either of them could speak, a deep rumble spread across the horizon, shaking the stillness with a warning that felt almost personal. Villagers hurried across the path outside, calling to one another, gathering children, securing animals, and preparing for a tempest that seemed determined to swallow the evening whole. The first strike of lightning tore across the sky with a brilliance that illuminated the entire village for a breath, and the thunder that followed crashed like a force trying to crack the world open. Wind surged through the streets, lifting dust and bending branches, pushing fiercely against the doors and windows of every home. Amara's mother moved quickly, her voice steady but urgent as she instructed Amara to gather their belongings and brace the shutters. The clay oven shook, the tables trembled, and for the first time in years, the bakery felt too fragile, too exposed to the fury rising outside. Cheek stepped in without hesitation. Though still regaining strength from the hardships he had endured, something fierce awoke within him as he moved through the small home with calm purpose. He steadied the door each time a violent gust tried to tear it open. He guided Amara and her mother away from the unstable shelves, shielding them with an instinct that seemed shaped not only by strength, but by a deep protective nature he could not suppress. The storm roared louder, banging against the walls with relentless force. Yet amidst it all, Cheek's presence felt like an anchor, quiet, determined, unwavering. For a moment, as lightning flashed again, Amara caught a glimpse of Cheek's profile, sharp tension in his jaw, eyes focused, shoulders squared with a calm discipline that revealed more than he intended. Something about the storm awakened buried fragments within him. Something about the danger stirring around them loosened the barriers he held tightly in his heart. When a tremor shook the back wall and Amara flinched, he turned toward her with a look that carried a depth she had sensed before, but never fully understood. As the storm intensified, so did the silence between them, thick with unspoken truths. The thunder outside matched the turmoil she sensed in him, as though nature itself demanded that he stop hiding behind fragments of explanation. Cheek's breathing shifted, steady but heavier, and when Iwaihuai finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years he had spent running from shadows. He revealed that he was not merely a traveler fallen on hard times. He belonged to a noble family known for generations for their mastery of bread-making, bakers whose craft was cherished far beyond the borders of their homeland. His father, a man of honor and community, had built an empire rooted in tradition, but after his passing, the peace that once held their family together shattered. Greed crept into the hearts of certain relatives, turning kinship into rivalry. They plotted to erase Cheek's rightful claim, using deception to steal the inheritance meant to preserve his father's legacy. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the strain of reliving a loss layered in betrayal. He explained how he fled under threat, carrying nothing but the carved bracelet, a symbol of his lineage, and the fragments of memory he refused to abandon. Amara felt the gravity of his confession settle deep in the room, blending with the storm's fury, until both felt indistinguishable. Her mother listened in quiet disbelief, her expression softening into empathy as the truth reshaped her perception of the man who had been a stranger only days before. Chika lowered his gaze, the stormlight flickering across his face, illuminating the pain of someone who had lost both home and heritage. But beneath that pain, Amara sensed another emotion, a fear that the storm outside was not the only force chasing him. Could the same enemies who stole Chik's birthright now be drawing closer to Udala, closing the distance between past betrayal and the fragile safety he had found here, carried by the very winds shaking their walls tonight? Sometimes strangers become family in the single unexpected moment when the heart stops resisting and recognizes a truth it has long been searching for, connection born not of blood, but of shared struggle, quiet grace, and the courage to trust again. In the days that followed the storm, a gentle transformation unfolded inside Amara's home, a transformation that began not with words, but with the quiet, natural rhythm of shared living. Chike moved with a softened caution, as though he feared overstepping boundaries, yet each task he took on was met with appreciation rather than tension. Amara's mother, once guarded, began allowing herself small moments of ease in his presence. She offered advice on kneading techniques, shared stories about past struggles, and even laughed lightly at his attempts to master certain tools with unfamiliar precision. Though she kept her wisdom close, she watched him with the perceptive eyes of someone who understood the weight of loss and recognized the sincerity in his efforts. Amara noticed the subtle shift every day. Chika no longer seemed like a man drifting between places. Instead, he moved with a purpose shaped by belonging, as though rebuilding the bakery gave him a new anchor after years of wandering through uncertainty. Together, Amara, her mother, and Cheek repaired the damaged shelves, restored cracked walls, and reorganized the small workspace into something sturdier than before. What had once been a modest bakery carried now the careful touches of Cheek's skill, smoother surfaces, sturdier supports, improved airflow that made the oven's heat more efficient. The changes were quiet, but meaningful, like layers of resilience stacked upon each other. As the bakery took new shape, the bread transformed even more noticeably. Where once it had carried the simple comfort of home, now it held a depth that surprised customers. The crust developed a subtle crispness that broke softly to reveal warm, tender crumb inside. The scent that drifted from the oven seemed richer, almost nostalgic, like something that stirred memory even in those who could not name what they remembered. Villagers began returning regularly, drawn not only by flavor, but by the sense of intention woven into each loaf. Some called it the best bread they had tasted. Others said it reminded them of something lost, revived unexpectedly in the heart of Udala. Amara watched these changes with a mixture of pride and quiet wonder. She saw how Cheek's hands moved with careful confidence, shaping dough as though it carried a lineage within it. She saw how he treated the craft not as a task, but as a responsibility, each loaf a tribute to something deeper than the present moment. In those silent exchanges between hands and dough, she sensed the shadows of his past and the struggles that shaped him. But she also saw something else, a man finding his way back to himself through work that had once defined his family. The village began to accept Cheek with an openness that surprised even him. Children lingered near the bakery, watching with wide eyes as he pulled loaves from the oven. Elders greeted him with nods of approval, recognizing skill wrapped in humility. Women brought small gifts, fresh vegetables, cloth scraps, herbs for the household, gestures of welcome shaped by gratitude rather than obligation. Over time, Cheek's presence blended into the village rhythm. He greeted neighbors, listened patiently to their stories, and offered help whenever needed. He did not speak much of his past, but the villagers did not demand explanations. They simply appreciated the sincerity woven into each gesture. Yet acceptance came with something else: curiosity. Though most villagers treated him kindly, strangers passing through Udala often paused when they noticed the carved bracelet he wore. Its symbols, intricate and ancient, seemed to draw quiet attention. Travelers occasionally leaned closer, their eyes narrowing with recognition before they continued on their way, with whispered comments that left Amara uneasy. Some asked direct questions: where he came from, who taught him to carve, why such a bracelet belonged to someone living so modestly. Chike responded with polite distance, offering only pieces of story rather than the whole. Amara sensed a subtle shift beneath these encounters. What began as curiosity slowly sharpened into something else: whispers traveling ahead of faces, gentle inquiries layered with intent she could not decipher. The bracelet, once a quiet reminder of his past, now seemed to glow with attention, a symbol too recognizable for comfort. On some evenings, Chike sat in silence, longer than usual, his gaze fixed on the bracelet as though listening for something in its carved lines. The villagers who knew him saw the way his expression changed when strangers asked questions. They noticed the tension in his shoulders, the careful moderation in his voice. A few offered him reassurance, simple statements of trust, but even their warmth could not erase the unsettled feeling that followed him through the day. Amara felt it too, like a quiet warning drifting through the air. The bakery, once a refuge for him, now also became a place where echoes of his past brushed lightly against the present. And though he worked with steady hands, she sensed the storm gathering again, not in the sky this time, but in the world he carried with him. As Cheek's past finally traced its way to the place he hoped would shelter him, sending whispers of danger into the calm he has begun to rebuild in Udala. Not every threat arrives with raised voices. Some slip quietly through the doorway with gentle smiles, soft words, and intentions sharp enough to cut through the calm. A polite greeting can hide storms deeper than thunder. And sometimes, danger wears a familiar face, returning not with force, but with the confidence of someone who believes their claim has never been questioned. The bakery glowed with the warm scent of freshly baked bread, the air filled with a comforting mixture of heat, spice, and quiet conversation. Morning traders passed by the windows, children laughed as they chased each other through the dusty street, and the soft chatter of customers filled the shop with an ease that had taken months to build. Amara arranged loaves across the counter with a rhythm that had become second nature. Chike worked beside her, shaping dough with careful precision, his movements steady and graceful, each gesture reflecting the discipline of someone who had found purpose again. The door creaked open, and two men stepped inside, well-dressed, polished, exuding wealth that contrasted sharply with the humble surroundings. Their clothes were tailored and crisp, their sandals crafted from fine leather, and their posture carried the air of men accustomed to commanding attention without raising their voices. At first glance, they could have been merchants from a distant town, traders seeking food along their route. But something about their presence struck Amara immediately. The stillness around them, the precision in their smiles, the quiet confidence in their eyes that suggested they felt entitled rather than grateful. Chaika froze. The dough in his hands slipped slightly, though he recovered quickly, placing it down with the same care he used for everything in the bakery. But Amara noticed the shift, the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the quick inhale he tried to conceal, the shadow that crossed his expression before he turned away from the counter. It was the look of someone recognizing ghosts long believed escaped. The two men scanned the bakery with polite curiosity until their eyes landed on Chaik, and then their smiles deepened, not with warmth, but with certainty. "Ah," the taller one said, stepping forward with slow, deliberate grace. "We've finally found him." His tone was gentle, almost appreciative, as though Chike had been hiding as part of a game rather than running for his life. The second man's smile carried no humor, only satisfaction. They exchanged a brief look, silent communication passing between them like a pact sealed long ago. Amara felt her heartbeat shift into an uneasy rhythm. Something in their posture, their casual confidence, made her stomach tighten. She glanced at Cheek again, studying the way he kept his gaze low for a moment before slowly lifting it to meet theirs. In his eyes, she saw a mixture of resignation and defiance, two emotions battling quietly beneath the surface. The taller man clasped his hands together. "You've built quite a life for yourself here." "Impressive." His compliment was wrapped in a tone that suggested anything but admiration. "But you know why we're here, Chaik. It is time to return. There are matters that require your presence." Chaik swallowed, the movement small, yet visible. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, but edged with controlled tension. "I have no place there anymore." The shorter man stepped forward, his careful smile thinning. "That isn't for you to decide. You left responsibilities unfinished, and the name you carry does not disappear simply because you abandoned it." Amira felt the men's words settle in her chest like stones. She watched Cheek's composure hold steady, even as pain flashed briefly in his eyes. Every detail of his posture revealed a struggle, an instinct to step back, warring with a need to protect those around him. He had fled that life for a reason, and these men felt too polished, too rehearsed, too comfortable in the control they believed they still held over him. Their politeness made the moment feel sharper, as though each sentence carried an unspoken threat wrapped in velvet. Amara sensed danger woven into every gesture. The way they scanned the bakery, the way they positioned themselves, the way they spoke without raising their voices yet commanded the room as if it belonged to them. When they finally turned their attention to her, their smiles tightened further, carrying the weight of a warning she could feel, even without words. She held their gaze without flinching, her instincts prompting her to stand near Chaik as an act of quiet solidarity. The taller man returned his gaze to Chaik, leaning slightly closer. "This peaceful little life you've built, did you really think it would remain untouched? Did you believe we wouldn't find you?" The question lingered in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Will Udala stand by Chaika when the polished cruelty of his past arrives at their doorstep? Or will the village bend beneath the quiet pressure of men who hide their menace behind courteous smiles? When lies rise boldly against truth, the world holds its breath, waiting to see which one has the strength to endure the fire of exposure. And though deception often speaks louder, truth carries a quiet power that refuses to bend beneath the weight of greed. The tension that began in the bakery did not fade with the passing hours. Word spread through Udala faster than the morning wind, drawing villagers toward the open space near the marketplace, where the two polished strangers had demanded a public conversation. Their voices were measured but sharp, dripping with practiced authority, as they claimed that Chika had stolen from his own family business, embezzling funds, forging documents, and abandoning responsibilities he was entrusted with. Their accusations unfurled like a rehearsed performance, each word chosen to tarnish the dignity he had rebuilt. They spoke as if the villagers should be offended that such a man had lived among them quietly, serving bread while carrying betrayal in his history. Amara stood near Chaik, her heart pounding with frustration that simmered beneath her composure. She watched how the crowd shifted uneasily, unsure how to navigate the sudden collapse of the peace they had grown used to. Chaka remained still, his posture steady, his gaze lowered not in shame, but in contemplation. He allowed the accusations to run their course, his silence unsettling the men who expected him to argue or cower. Their words grew bolder, painting him as a manipulator who had fled after nearly destroying a legacy built by generations. They spoke with the confidence of men who believed their lies had already won the room. But the villagers of Udala were not quick to swallow such claims. Weeks of observing Chika's integrity had shaped their trust in him. They had seen his discipline, his humility, and the reverence with which he approached every task. The idea of him stealing, even from his own family, did not sit comfortably with their understanding of his character. Murmurs rose through the crowd, and the men, sensing the shift, pressed harder, accusing Chik of fleeing justice and hiding behind the kindness of unsuspecting villagers. When Chik finally lifted his gaze, the marketplace grew silent. His voice, when it emerged, carried a calm strength sharpened by truth rather than anger. He did not raise it, did not tremble, did not attempt to match the theatrics of those who sought to destroy him. Instead, he began to recount the story he had carried, in silence for far too long. He spoke of his father, a man of integrity whose bakery empire was cherished for its honesty and craftsmanship. He described the shift that came after his father's passing, when greed seeped into the hearts of relatives who once pretended loyalty. Documents were forged, decisions manipulated, accounts drained subtly over time. When Chika questioned the discrepancies, he was silenced, cornered, and eventually threatened. The polished men interrupted frequently, trying to distort the narrative, but Chika continued with unwavering clarity. His tone was steady, each word measured, revealing the truth not through emotion, but through the quiet weight of lived experience. He spoke of the night he fled, not to escape guilt, but to escape the trap they had built, a trap designed to make him the scapegoat for their crimes. His carved bracelet, revealed gently in his explanation, was the last inheritance from his father, a symbol of the legacy meant to pass through him. The villagers demanded proof, real proof. Their voices rose with insistence, their loyalty tilting visibly toward Chik. The men hesitated. Their answers began to falter. Their polished confidence cracked slightly under the pressure. Each contradiction they offered tangled with another, exposing gaps in their story. A few elders stepped forward, recalling having seen noble families fall into ruin due to internal betrayal. Their recollections aligned far more closely with Chik's quiet revelation than with the loud claims of the strangers. As the minutes passed, the facade the men wore began to crumble. Their smiles tightened, their tone sharpened with irritation rather than authority. The villagers exchanged knowing glances, recognizing that greed had shaped the lies being presented to them. And Chuck, though tired from the weight of revisiting old wounds, stood with a dignity that made their accusations appear small and desperate. When the men finally realized the room no longer belonged to them, a sharp silence followed, one filled not with fear, but with clarity. Now that truth has stripped the shadows from his past, what future will Chike choose? One shaped by the life he fled, or one waiting quietly in the village that dared to believe him? Sometimes dreams grow strongest in the very places where hope once faltered, rising quietly from dust and disappointment until they stand tall enough to reshape the future. And sometimes two dreams, born from separate wounds, meet in a single moment and discover they have been waiting for each other all along. The days following the confrontation brought a softer energy to Udala, as though the village itself exhaled deeply after witnessing truth triumph over deceit. Chiki carried himself differently now, not with pride, but with a lighter weight, as though a long-held burden had loosened its grip on his chest. He moved with clearer intention, his steps grounded, his voice steadier. Amara noticed the transformation, in quiet moments, the way his eyes softened when he worked the dough, the way he paused before speaking, the way gratitude radiated through his actions without needing words. It was as though he was slowly reclaiming pieces of himself that had scattered when betrayal forced him to flee. One evening, as the last embers of sunlight faded across the sky, Chika walked with Amara behind the bakery, where a small clearing opened to the fields. The air was cool and tender, carrying the scent of earth and ash from distant fires used for evening meals. He paused beneath the Udala tree, the same tree under which she had first found him, and spoke with a quiet sincerity that rested between vulnerability and resolve. He shared the dream he had buried long before arriving in Udala, the dream of restoring his father's legacy, not the empire of wealth others fought to steal, but the values it stood upon: craft, dignity, community, and the belief that bread held the power to bring people together in ways words sometimes could not. As he spoke, Amara felt a stirring in her chest, not of surprise, but of recognition. She had grown up kneading dough with hands that always hoped for something more, something that reached beyond the limits of their small, struggling bakery. For years, she had harbored her own quiet dream of owning a proper bakery, one built with care, not patched together from necessity. A place with enough space for creativity, enough warmth for customers to gather, and enough strength to carry her mother's legacy into the future. A dream she had never voiced fully, fearing it was too large for someone with so little. She took a slow breath and shared it with him. The confession settled between them like a seed falling gently into fertile soil. Chike listened with a reverence that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. As she described her vision, open shelves, wide ovens, tables carved from local wood, Cheek's eyes lit with a recognition deeper than admiration. Her dream aligned effortlessly with the one he carried, each piece complementing the other, forming a shared vision stronger than either of them could have imagined alone. What began as a conversation grew into intention, and intention grew into action. They spoke for hours, sketching ideas in the dirt, imagining layouts, planning how to merge old traditions with new beginnings. When Amara's mother found them later, her gaze softened at the sight of their determination. She listened as they explained their vision, and though she worried for the challenges ahead, she recognized the earnest purpose in their voices. She nodded slowly, offering not only approval, but her support. Word of their dream traveled swiftly through the village. Far from dismissing it as ambition beyond their means, the villagers embraced it with an enthusiasm that surprised even Amara. They offered materials, skills, and time. Carpenters arrived with wooden beams, potters brought clay. For bricks, elders contributed designs rooted in tradition, and young people volunteered their labor with spirited pride. Udala came alive with a collective energy, its people united in building something that felt as though it belonged to them all. Chiki worked in the center of it, guiding construction with calm precision. His hands, once weary from loss, now moved with purpose and direction. Amara, equally invested, coordinated efforts with grace and a quiet determination that reminded everyone why they were helping. Day by day, the new bakery began to rise, its shape emerging confidently from the dust. Walls framed with strength, windows carved to let in light, and a hearth designed to hold both warmth and memories. Each stage of progress brought new excitement. Villagers paused during their daily routines to admire the structure, offering advice, stories, and laughter. It became clear that the bakery represented more than food. It represented renewal, unity, and the possibility that even broken pasts could be rebuilt into something meaningful. But beneath the joy, a quiet tension lingered in the air. Chica felt it in the way evening shadows stretched longer than usual. Amara sensed it too, in the way her mother occasionally glanced toward the road leading out of the village. Dreams, no matter how pure, never rose without facing one final test that demanded courage and clarity. As the walls of their shared dream rose higher, what unseen challenge waited just beyond the horizon, ready to test their hope before it could become reality? When flames rise without warning, destiny steps forward and demands courage from those who dare to dream, forcing the heart to prove whether its hope is strong enough to survive the heat that threatens to destroy it. The Harmattan winds arrived quietly at first, brushing across Udala with a dry breath that carried dust from distant lands. The air grew brittle, leaves cracking beneath the slightest touch, and the usual warmth of afternoon sun felt sharper, as though it pressed too closely against the skin. Villagers spoke in cautious tones, mindful of how easily fire awakened during this season. Even so, life continued with an underlying hum of anticipation as the new bakery's construction neared completion. The beams stood tall, the oven's structure had taken form, and Amara spent her evenings imagining the scent of future bread filling the space. Cheek worked beside her, determined to protect the dream they had built, piece by fragile piece. But just as dusk settled one restless evening, a spark, small, unseen, and devastatingly placed, found its way into a pile of dry brush behind a row of houses. The Harmattan wind lifted it like a mischievous whisper, carrying it farther until flames sprang to life with terrifying speed. Within minutes, they expanded into a line of fire that twisted upward in fierce orange ribbons. The alarm spread across the village in desperate shouts, the kind that carried fear deeper than words. Children cried out, elders stumbled from doorways, and the village, usually wrapped in calm twilight, erupted into frantic motion. Amara was the first to smell the smoke, a sharp, searing scent that sent a chill slicing through her. She and Cheek rushed outside, their eyes widening at the sight of flames devouring the edges of the village like a hungry tide. Without hesitation, they ran toward the danger. Cheek moved with determination sharpened by instinct, guiding people away from collapsing structures, pulling water buckets from wells, and urging frightened families toward safety. Amara, fueled by a mixture of fear and resolve, wrapped cloth around her face and assisted wherever hands were needed, her heart pounding with each passing second. The wind roared through Udala, fanning the flames mercilessly. Yet through the chaos, Chica's voice remained steady, directing villagers with clarity, and he supported the sight of their dream. When the last flames died and smoke drifted into the cooling night air, people turned toward Amara and Cheek, their expressions filled with empathy rather than sorrow. Elders approached with reassurance, promising resources to rebuild what the fire had claimed. Young villagers, still breathless from the frantic efforts, offered to work extra days to replace what was lost. Even families whose homes had been threatened stood tall, insisting that the bakery represented hope for everyone, not just for two dreamers. Chucky looked around him, overwhelmed not by loss but by the powerful unity rising from the ashes. He saw strength in the villagers' tired eyes, determination in their soot-covered hands, and loyalty in the way they gathered around the damaged structure, as if guarding it from further harm. Amara stood beside him, breathing deeply, her gaze reflecting resilience rather than defeat. She felt the quiet truth settling inside her. Dreams, built with community, could withstand storms, fire, and fear. As they surveyed the remnants of the day, Chike reached for a half-burnt beam and pressed his hand against it gently, honoring what had survived. Amara stepped beside him, sensing that the fire had not taken anything essential. It had revealed something instead. It had shown that their dream no longer belonged only to them. It belonged to Udala. With the fire extinguished but embers of destiny still glowing beneath the surface, what final moment remains, waiting in the quiet shadows, to mark the true birth of their long-awaited dream? Every great story begins with a moment so small it almost disappears, until destiny amplifies it into a turning point. A single gesture, offered without expectation, can ripple outward until it reshapes lives, communities, and futures. And sometimes, the quietest kindness becomes the foundation of a legacy stronger than stone. The first morning of the bakery's opening rose with a softness that felt almost ceremonial. The sun stretched its early light across Udalla, slipping through the handmade windows Chica and the villagers had crafted with careful devotion. Golden beams poured into the space like blessings, brushing over polished counters, fresh clay tiles, and the great new oven that stood like the heart of everything they had built. Amara stood at the doorway, her breath catching for a moment as she took in the transformation. It felt unreal. This space that once existed only in her imagination now stood before her, alive, warm, and filled with the promise of new beginnings. Chaike walked beside her, his steps steady, but filled with quiet emotion. The scent of dough rising inside the oven mingled with the soft sounds of villagers gathering outside, their voices carrying a mix of pride and anticipation. The bakery had become more than a building. It had become a symbol of resilience, community, and the strength born from compassion. As the door opened fully, a small crowd stepped closer, their eyes wide with admiration. They saw not just a bakery, but a testament to what could be built when hearts aligned in purpose. Before the first loaf was served, Chike asked Amara and her mother to stand with him near the center of the bakery. With the villagers gathered around, he lifted a hand toward the wooden sign above the entrance. It had been carved carefully, each letter shaped with patience and respect. When the cloth covering was drawn aside, a hush drifted through the crowd. Carved into the wood were the words, "Amara's hearth, where kindness rises." Amara's heart tightened. She turned toward Chaik, emotion overwhelming her for a moment. She had expected a name tied to his heritage, his lineage, or his father's legacy. Instead, he had chosen to anchor the bakery in the very act that changed both their lives, her decision to share her last loaf with a starving stranger. Chike met her gaze with a soft steadiness. "This dream began because you chose compassion when you had little to give," he said quietly. "Whatever we build from this day forward should rise from that same place." The villagers erupted into warm applause, their faces bright with admiration. Even Amara's mother blinked back emotion, understanding the depth of what Chike had honored. It wasn't simply a name, it was a story carved into wood, preserved for generations to come. As the day unfolded, people traveled from nearby villages, drawn by the whispers that had spread far beyond Udalla's borders. They came with curiosity at first, but curiosity quickly turned to appreciation as they tasted bread shaped from tradition, skill, and heart. The loaves carried a delicate balance of old and new, flavors that honored Chike's heritage while embracing the spirit of Udalla. Customers paused between bites, savoring not just the taste, but the meaning behind it. Some said the bread felt alive with memory. Others claimed it carried warmth that lingered in the chest long after eating. Amara moved through the bakery with a calm confidence she had never known before. She greeted customers with sincerity, listened to their stories, and felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of belonging settle into her bones. Chike worked beside her, blending precision with instinct, his hands steady as they shaped dough into forms reminiscent of both his past and his new beginning. Together, they created a rhythm that filled the bakery with quiet triumph, two lives intertwining through shared purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the bakery bustled with activity. Laughter rose from tables arranged outside. Children darted in and out with sticky fingers and excited grins, and elders murmured blessings as they savored each bite. Amid the joy, Amara sensed something deeper weaving itself through the day, a recognition that their future had expanded beyond what either of them once imagined. This bakery was not merely a place of business, it had become a sanctuary of hope and renewal. Near dusk, when the final customers departed and the golden light mellowed into evening, Amara and Cheek stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. The village lay quiet now, but inside the bakery, the warmth lingered, glowing through the windows like a promise still unfolding. Amara looked at Chica, her heart full of gratitude, curiosity, and the subtle excitement of a path stretching before them. He glanced back at her, the weight of his past no longer clouding his expression. Instead, there was clarity, a sense of purpose strengthened by everything they had survived and everything they had built together. The day had revealed not just a dream realized, but the beginning of something far greater. For this was only the beginning of a destiny still unfolding, shaped by one shared loaf, one choice of compassion, and a future neither of them yet understood. If this story touched your heart and stirred your imagination, then don't leave without becoming part of our journey. Subscribe now so you never miss the next cinematic tale waiting in the shadows of destiny. Share this video with someone who believes kindness still shapes miracles. And tell me in the comments, what moment in this story stayed with you long after the final word?